At 12:47 in the morning, the brass bell above Clara Whitmore's door rang once, then it rang again. Not the bright little chime customers heard in daylight. This sound was sharp, desperate. Clara looked up from the freight ledger and saw a man pounding on the glass with one hand, while the other arm held a crying child against his chest. He had ridden through 7 miles of freezing rain. Not for a doctor, not for the sheriff, for milk. Clara unlocked the door. The cowboy stumbled inside carrying a little girl wrapped in a saddle blanket. She was no more than 2, with damp brown curls stuck to her cheeks and one tiny boot fastened on the wrong foot. "Please," the man said, breathing hard. "Please tell me you have milk." The child lifted her face from his coat. "Milk," she sobbed. Clara slid the bolt back into place. "I have milk. Bring her to the stove." The man crossed the mercantile as if his knees had finally remembered they were tired. He sat beside the cast-iron stove and settled the girl on his lap, rubbing her back with a hand rough from rope and winter work. Clara poured fresh milk into a tin saucepan. The man watched every movement. "I meant to come to town yesterday," he said. A heifer tore through the north fence. By the time I got it mended, the light was gone. I put her to bed and she started asking for milk. His voice tightened. "I searched every shelf twice, like the jar might fill itself if I looked hard enough." Clara set the pan over the flame. "What is her name, Maggie? And yours?" "Elias Reed. I run the spread beyond Cottonwood Ridge." Clara glanced back. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew the Reed place. It had once belonged to Elias and his young wife Ruth, until spring pneumonia took her in less than a week. Clara had seen the funeral wagon pass the mercantile 7 months earlier. She remembered Elias sitting straight beside the coffin, one arm around a little girl too young to understand why every adult in town was crying. "I'm sorry about Ruth." Elias lowered his eyes. "Most days I can keep the ranch moving. I can feed the stock. I can wash clothes badly enough that they still count as clean." A tired, humorless laugh escaped him. "But tonight she kept crying and I had nothing she wanted. I felt like the worst father in Montana Territory." The milk began to steam. Clara poured it into a chipped blue cup and tested the warmth against her wrist. Then she placed it in Maggie's hands. The little girl drank so quickly Clara had to steady the cup. For the first time since the door opened, the room went quiet. Elias closed his eyes. The relief on his face was so complete it looked almost like pain. Clara crouched beside him. Bad fathers do not saddle a horse in freezing rain and ride 7 miles for a cup of milk. Elias opened his eyes. "No, no. Bad fathers stay home and explain why the child should stop crying. You came." Maggie finished the milk and stared into the empty cup. "More," Clara smiled. "A little more. Slowly this time." While she warmed a second cup, Elias removed his hat. His dark hair was wet and flattened on one side. His shirt had been buttoned wrong near the collar, and one suspender hung loose beneath his coat. He looked less like the capable rancher people described in town, and more like a man who had been carrying 2 lives with one pair of hands. "Why is your lamp still burning?" he asked. "Freight wagon came early. I had 6 crates to count." "At midnight?" Clara shrugged. "I live upstairs. And Hollow Creek has a habit of needing things after respectable people have gone to sleep." Maggie drank her second cup more carefully. Her eyelids began to sink. Then she noticed the glass jar on the counter. Inside were striped lemon drops. She pointed. "Son?" Clara laughed softly. "That is candy." Maggie looked at Elias. He looked at the clock. Clara lifted one finger. "1 for courage." Elias surrendered with a tired smile. "1. Clara handed Maggie a yellow sweet. The child held it up to the lamplight as if it were a piece of captured sunrise. "Pretty," she whispered. Then she pointed at Clara. "Pretty." Elias turned red beneath the cold in his cheeks. "Maggie." Clara pretended not to notice his embarrassment. "Thank you. Your curls are prettier." Maggie touched her damp hair and smiled around the candy. Within minutes, she was asleep against her father's chest. Elias stood carefully. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing tonight. I can pay." "I know." Clara picked up the blue cup, then changed her mind and tucked it into the saddle blanket beside Maggie. "Bring the cup back in daylight." Elias looked at her. It was not charity, it was an invitation. "Saturday?" he asked. "I bake raisin biscuits on Saturday." Maggie shifted in his arms but did not wake. Elias put on his hat. "Then we will return your cup on Saturday." At the door, Clara held the lamp high while he mounted. Freezing rain silvered the street. Every window in Hollow Creek was dark except hers. "Elias," he turned in the saddle, "you did not fail her tonight." For a moment, he could not answer. Then he nodded once and rode toward Cottonwood Ridge with Maggie asleep beneath his coat. Clara stood in the doorway until the hoofbeats disappeared. The milk had solved the small emergency. But the look Elias gave the light in her window told Clara the night had carried something else through the door, something neither of them was ready to name. Elias returned on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. He had shaved. His shirt was clean. Maggie wore a mustard yellow dress with tiny pearl buttons and a crooked hem that had clearly been sewn by loving hands, not professional ones. She marched into the mercantile holding the blue cup in both hands. "Cup," she announced. Clara accepted it solemnly. "You returned it in excellent condition. Biscuit?" Maggie asked. Elias closed his eyes. "I told her we were returning the cup. I made no promises about biscuits." Clara leaned toward Maggie. "Fortunately, I did. The raisin biscuits were still warm." Clara served them with butter, a little apple preserve, and a cup of milk that Maggie watched with deep concentration. The girl ate at a small table near the stove. Elias helped Clara move a sack of flour that had been blocking the back shelf. Then he noticed a loose shutter hinge and repaired it before she could object. By closing time, Maggie had discovered a cloth rabbit in the toy bin. She named it Captain. Clara poured imaginary tea for Captain while Elias sat on an upturned crate and watched. There was a softness in his face Clara had not seen the night of the storm, not happiness exactly, but the memory of it. The visits continued, first once a week, then twice. Elias always arrived with a practical reason: coffee, lamp oil, harness soap, a spool of thread he claimed Maggie needed, though he could not explain why she needed a different color every Tuesday. Maggie stopped calling Clara pretty lady. She began calling her Miss Clara. Then, one morning, Lantern Lady. "Because your light was on," Maggie explained. The name stayed. Clara kept a folded blanket behind the counter for Maggie's naps. She saved biscuit ends for Captain. She learned that Maggie hated peas, loved horses from a safe distance, and could identify every customer by the sound of their boots. Elias learned that Clara had inherited the mercantile from her aunt, that both her brothers had gone east to work for the railroad, and that every letter from them ended with the same question: "When are you finally leaving that little town?" "I tell them the same thing every time," Clara said. "What? That little town still need flour?" Elias smiled. "And lamps? Especially lamps." By October, people in Hollow Creek had begun arranging their errands around the Reed visits. The blacksmith's wife lingered over buttons she did not need. The school teacher found reasons to examine writing slates. No one said much in front of Elias, but the whole town could see what he could not. Maggie had begun to bloom in the warmth between two lonely adults, and Clara had started listening for wagon wheels every Tuesday and Saturday. Then the first snow came early. On Tuesday, the Reed wagon did not appear. By noon, Clara had checked the road 4 times. By dusk, she told herself the drift was too deep. At 8 that night, someone hammered on the back door. It was a stable boy from Cottonwood Ridge, white-faced and shaking. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Reed says the little girl is burning with fever. Dr. Bell is trapped across the river." Clara did not stop to close the ledger. She packed clean cloths, broth, lamp oil, and the blue cup. The hotel keeper drove her as far as the lower trail. From there, Elias met her on horseback with a lantern tied to the saddle horn. His face when he saw her was worse than it had been the night he came for milk. Maggie lay in Ruth's old bed, cheeks scarlet, breath shallow and quick. Elias stood beside her, gripping the bedpost. "It started this afternoon," he said. "Ruth started with a fever." His voice broke. "Not the same fever," Clara said. "You do not know that." "No." She looked directly at him. "But we are in this hour, Elias, not the last one. Help me with this hour." They worked through the night. Clara changed cool cloths. Elias carried water. When Maggie woke frightened, Clara told her a story about Captain Rabbit stealing biscuits from a judge. At 3 in the morning, Maggie asked for milk. Clara poured a little into the blue cup. The child managed 3 sips. Then she caught Clara's sleeve. "Light stays?" Clara held her hand. "The light stays." Near dawn, the fever eased, not all at once. First, Maggie's breathing softened, then the hard heat left her forehead. Then she opened her eyes and asked whether Captain had been arrested. Elias turned away so his daughter would not see him cry. Clara saw. She said nothing. Later, she found him at the kitchen table with his head bowed over his folded arms. "I nearly lost them both," he whispered. "Ruth, and now Maggie." Clara sat across from him. "You nearly lost Maggie." He looked up. "That is not the same as losing her." The difference was small enough to fit inside one sentence. It was large enough to save him. Maggie recovered over the next 3 days. Clara stayed until the doctor crossed the river and said the worst had passed. When she finally prepared to leave, Maggie wrapped both arms around her neck. "No go, lantern lady." Clara closed her eyes. Elias stood in the doorway. For one dangerous second, none of them pretended this was still about flour, lamp oil, or a returned cup. Then Elias stepped back. "Let Miss Clara go home, sweetheart." Clara heard the distance in his voice. She went home, and Elias did not come on Tuesday, or Saturday, or the Tuesday after that. At first, Clara blamed the snow, then she blamed ranch work. By the third week, she stopped preparing an extra biscuit. Maggie's blanket remained folded beneath the counter. The blue cup remained on the shelf. The store felt larger without them, and much colder. Elias had not stayed away because he felt nothing. He stayed away because he felt too much. At the livery, two men had joked that Hollow Creek would soon have a new Mrs. Reed. Elias had laughed with them, then gone home sick with guilt. Ruth's dresses still hung in the back room. Her sewing basket remained beside the chair. Every step toward Clara felt to him like a step away from the woman buried under the cottonwood tree. So he chose silence and called it loyalty. Clara called it an answer. In January, she received a letter from her older brother in Denver. He had purchased a larger dry goods store and offered her a partnership. For the first time, Clara wrote back and said yes. She placed a small card in the mercantile window. "Business for sale by spring." Elias saw the card on a gray February afternoon. Maggie was holding his hand. The child pressed both palms against the glass. "No," she said. Inside, Clara was wrapping coffee for a customer. She saw them. Her hands stopped. Elias entered alone after asking Maggie to wait with the blacksmith's wife. "You are leaving? In April. Why?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Because Denver needs dry goods." "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound like flour." Clara tied the coffee parcel so tightly the paper creased. "You stopped coming." "I was trying to do right by Ruth." "And did disappearing do right by Maggie?" The question landed harder than anger. Elias removed his hat. "I was afraid, so was I." He looked around the store, the stove, the biscuit tin, the folded blanket, the shelf where the blue cup waited. "I thought caring for you meant I was leaving Ruth behind." Clara's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "Ruth is not a lamp you have to extinguish before another one can burn. Love does not work by making the room darker." Elias stared at her. Outside, Maggie's small face remained at the window. Clara continued, "I would never ask you to erase her. She is Maggie's mother. She is part of your life. A breath. But grief cannot be the only thing allowed to live in that house." Elias lowered his head. The bell over the door gave a tiny movement in the winter draft. He said, "I do not know how to begin again." Clara looked at the card in the window. "Neither do I. That does not mean there is no beginning." That evening, Elias took Ruth's sewing basket from beside the chair. Beneath the thread and thimble, he found a letter from Ruth's mother that had arrived months earlier. He had read it once, then hidden it because the words hurt. This time, he read it slowly. She had written that Maggie could remember one mother and still love another woman, that Elias could honor a marriage without turning his remaining life into a memorial, that loyalty to the dead should not require cruelty to the living. The next morning, Elias saddled his horse before sunrise. Maggie rode in front of him. Clara was opening the shutters when they entered. Elias placed his hat on the counter. "I have not come to stop you from leaving." Clara's face fell slightly. "I have come to give you a reason to stay." Maggie climbed onto a chair and watched him with enormous seriousness. Elias continued, "I cannot promise I will never be afraid. I cannot promise I will stop missing Ruth. I would not want that promise. But I can promise I will not hide behind missing her." He took a breath. "Clara Whitmore, will you allow me to court you properly?" Maggie leaned toward Clara. "Say yes." Clara laughed through tears. "Yes." The sale card came down that afternoon. Courtship changed less than the town expected. Elias still bought coffee he did not need. Maggie still stole biscuit raisins. Clara still corrected his terrible inventory arithmetic. But now Elias took Clara to Sunday supper without inventing a reason. He asked before taking her hand. He spoke Ruth's name without apology. Clara visited the ranch and never moved Ruth's sewing basket. Instead, she repaired the cushion on the chair beside it. By spring, Maggie could write the letter M. By summer, she could write C. She drew them together on every scrap of paper she found. 14 months after the midnight ride, Elias brought Maggie to the mercantile after closing. The brass bell rang once. Clara looked up. Elias wore his best coat. Maggie carried the chipped blue cup. Inside it were 3 small wildflowers and a silver ring. Clara covered her mouth. Elias smiled. The first time I came through this door, I asked you for enough milk to get us through one night. Tonight I am asking whether you will share all the nights that come after it." Maggie held the cup higher. "And biscuits," she added. Clara laughed, then cried, then said yes before Elias could become frightened enough to ask twice. They married in the Hollow Creek church at the end of summer. Maggie walked down the aisle scattering cottonwood leaves because the flower shipment never arrived. Halfway to the front, she forgot her instructions and ran straight to Clara. The congregation laughed softly. Clara knelt and opened her arms. After the vows, Maggie tugged at her sleeve. "Can I call you Mama Clara?" The church went still. Clara glanced at Elias, then she looked at Maggie. "You may call me Mama Clara." Maggie touched the locket around her own neck. Inside was a tiny picture of Ruth. "And Mama Ruth," Clara kissed her forehead. "Always Mama Ruth." Maggie considered this, then nodded, satisfied that the world had room for both. Years later, the blue cup sat on the Reed family mantel. Maggie told the story to her children whenever winter rain tapped the windows. She told them how their grandfather rode 7 miles because a little girl would not sleep without milk, how every building in town was dark except one, how the woman behind that light did not rescue them with a grand speech or a miracle. She warmed a cup, she kept the stove burning, she stayed through the fever, and when grief tried to close every door, she left one open. The family never called it the night the milk ran out. They called it the night one light was still burning.